This section is going to be dedicated to talking about water quality and pollution. So we've talked about how essential water is for a wide variety of human activities in different sectors and how fresh water sources get used up. We've also talked about water scarcity and how there's such a thing as economic scarcity, where enough water exists in a region to meet people's needs, but the water infrastructure, including water treatment plants, is lacking. In fact, a significant percentage of the world population lacks access to basic clean drinking water. In much of Asia, between 1 and 24% of people do not have access to clean drinking water, and in many parts of Africa, 25 to 50%, and even over 50% of people don't have clean drinking water available to them. And unsafe water is a huge public health issue in many parts of the world, and it actually kills more people than natural disasters and conflicts combined. In the year 2020, 485,000 people were killed by unsafe water, and the World Health Organization estimates that unsafe drinking water is responsible for about 80% of diseases in developing countries. That's a huge number. So, what makes water unsafe to drink? In this section, we're going to talk about different sources of pollution that affect water quality. Water quality is defined as the physical, chemical, and biological properties of water that impact its intended use. So, contaminants of any of these three types, physical, chemical, or biological, can degrade the quality of a sample of water. We'll talk about each of them, but first, one distinction to make is between different sources of pollution. In this next section, we're going to be focusing on largely surface water pollution, and later we'll also talk about groundwater pollution at the end, so keep that in mind. Point source pollution is the word used to describe water pollution coming from a single point. So, for example, a sewage pipe that's emptying into a river would be a type of point source pollution. Non-point source pollution is pollution that originates from a large dispersed area of land rather than a single point. So, for example, fertilizer runoff from a large tract of cropland or heavy metals that run off from city streets after it rains are both examples of non-point source pollution. We also divide surface water pollution up into three different types depending upon the nature of the contaminant. Chemical pollution is, of course, pollution that is derived from chemicals, including toxic heavy metals like lead or cadmium, fertilizers from agriculture, organic pollutants like those POPs that we talked about in a previous chapter, acid mine drainage, pharmaceuticals that get into the water supply when they're discharged from our bodies into the sewage system, materials from wastewater treatment plants, and radioactive waste. Physical pollutants include sediment pollution, which is the buildup of minerals, those sand, silt, and clay particles that we talked about before when we were talking about soil. These things can build up in waterways. Trash that's thrown into bodies of water is also physical pollution. And then thermal pollution, which is a bit different of a concept. The idea is that heat acts as a physical pollutant because raising the temperature of water can harm the aquatic organisms that live in that water. And then lastly, biological pollutants refers to infectious microscopic organisms in the water. And these include bacteria, viruses, parasitic protozoa, and parasitic worms. And these pathogens are usually introduced to the water through sewage contamination or contamination from the fecal matter of livestock operations. So we're going to walk through these categories of surface water pollution one by one, starting with chemical pollutants. The majority of inorganic chemical pollutants are non-point source pollutants. These include heavy metal contaminants from urban areas, which generate a lot of pollution from vehicle exhaust, for example, as well as heavy metals from mine tailings. This also includes nitrogen and phosphate fertilizers that run off from cropland, which is an issue we've talked about previously, and we're going to come back to it in just a moment. But not all chemical pollutants are non-point source. There are point source pollutants as well, including chlorine that gets used in water treatment facilities to kill pathogenic microorganisms to contaminate the water. So this agent that is actually used to remove a different type of pollution, biological pollutants, becomes in itself a chemical pollutant. Also, heavy metals that are in the waste released from industrial manufacturing plants are a chemical pollutant from a point source. But let's revisit the fertilizer pollutants because these are a big source of marine ecosystem collapse, and they've become more problematic in coastal areas around the US and around the world in recent years. The process that this fertilizer runoff initiates in marine ecosystems, as we've mentioned before, is called eutrophication. The way that eutrophication works is that excess fertilizer that's applied to cropland runs off into surface water sources, which then carry that fertilizer to the ocean. And there, the fertilizer fuels what's called an algal bloom, which is an explosion in the growth of algae and cyanobacteria that really thrive on nitrogen and phosphorus, the two main fertilizer ingredients. And these blooms become so dense that they block sunlight from penetrating the water and reaching aquatic plants like seaweed that rely on that sunlight to grow, and that kills them. And then when those algae die, they get consumed by decomposers in the ocean who use cellular respiration to break down their organic molecules for energy, and in the process, they consume oxygen, which depletes the oxygen from the water and suffocates the marine mammals, marine animals. Which these when this happens on a large scale, it's called a fish kill, which is a mass death of fish that have suffocated after an algal bloom. And as if that wasn't enough, some of these types of algae that are involved in these blooms produce toxic compounds called cyanotoxins that can directly kill aquatic animals and can also accumulate in shellfish and cause food poisoning in humans when those shellfish are harvested and consumed. All in all, the death of the marine plants and animals after eutrophication leads to what are called dead zones in the ocean. There's a well-known dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that occurs seasonally at the point where the Mississippi River Delta drains into the ocean. And as you can see from this image, the watershed area of the Mississippi River is huge. This is the drainage basin for the Mississippi River. And it ends up accumulating large amounts of fertilizer runoff from agriculture in the Midwest. And then it all drains into the Gulf of Mexico at this consolidated point every year. So the dead zone occurs seasonally in line with crop planting patterns. And so the size of the dead zone changes every year, but even in the smallest years, it's about the size of the state of Delaware. As we said, eutrophication events have been on the rise in coastal areas around the US and around the world, but there are several approaches that can reduce them. One of them is reducing the amount of fertilizer that's being used, as well as applying fertilizer to cropland in a more efficient, precise manner to maximize the potential of it being absorbed by crops rather than just running off the land. Another approach is protecting watersheds, which are areas of land that drain into rivers and lakes. Watershed is synonymous with a drainage basin, by maintaining vegetation cover that can interrupt the runoff into waterways. And finally, upgrading wastewater treatment plants to include technologies that remove fertilizers from water before it's discharged back into the environment. That wraps things up for chemical pollution. Now let's talk about physical pollution. So physical pollution comes in many forms, but the most significant one is excess sediment that runs off from erosion of cropland, as well as forested areas that have been clear-cut and other poorly managed lands. These mineral sediments can change the path of water in rivers and streams. They can also fill up storm drains and canals, and they can cause water to become murky, which blocks sunlight and inhibits the growth of aquatic plants, and that has consequences up the food chain. Other sources of physical pollution include plastic products that end up in surface water. This photo that you see here is of what's called the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a collection of floating plastic trash in the Pacific Ocean that covers 1.6 million square kilometers. And because plastic degrades so slowly, research on this patch has shown that a portion of the items in the patch are over 50 years old, and the patch is continuing to grow. Other sources of physical pollution are timber debris, paper and cardboard products, and thermal pollution. And thermal pollution, like I said, is different from these other types. It's included here because heat and temperature are a physical phenomenon. But thermal pollution is caused by the return flow of water that is hotter than the source of the water. So, for example, when a power plant withdraws water from a river to use it in a cooling capacity and then returns that water back to the water re enters at a hotter temperature compared to when it was taken out of the river, which then raises the temperature of the river water as a whole. And this thermal pollution can cause several consequences. One of them is lower levels of oxygen dissolved in the water, because as a general rule, the warmer the water, the less gas can be dissolved in it, and this includes oxygen gas. And as a result, with less oxygen available, the population of aquatic animals like fish can decline, and this can have extended consequences for the ecosystem. The last category of pollutant we'll talk about before closing out this section is biological pollution. Biological pollution refers to contaminants that are alive, so bacteria, viruses, parasitic protozoa, and parasitic worms. The most common waterborne bacterial pathogens include Escherichia coli, more commonly known as E. coli. E. coli is actually a harmless member of our gut microbiome, but certain strains can cause gastroenteritis. Shigella dysenteriae causes the severe diarrheal illness known as dysentery. Vibrio cholerae causes another severe diarrheal illness called cholera, and a specific serovar of salmonella called Salmonella enterica serovar typhi causes an infection you may have heard of called typhoid fever. And mostly these bacteria are transmitted from water that has been contaminated with fecal matter of an infected person or animal. The most common waterborne viral contaminants are rotavirus and norovirus. These are very common. There are 20 million cases of norovirus in the US alone every year, and 3 million cases of rotavirus. Rotavirus used to be much more common, but infants are given a vaccine for it now. And infections with these viruses and the above bacteria tend to have a very low mortality rate in developed industrialized countries like the US. Almost no one dies from them. However, they do have a high mortality rate in developing countries because their disease mechanism induces such severe diarrhea that it leads to life threatening dehydration, especially in infants and children. And in countries with weak medical infrastructure, where IV fluids are not readily available to treat these cases, these infections can be quite deadly. Some of the common waterborne parasitic protozoa are Giardia lamblia, which causes an infection simply known as Giardia. This is actually the most common parasitic infection in the US. My cat has had Giardia. I know people who have had Giardia. Entaviva histolytica is another. This causes another diarrheal illness called amoebic dysentery. And then there's an extensive list of parasitic worms that are transmitted through contaminated water. Some of the more major ones are schistosomiasis, which you can acquire just through skin contact with contaminated water, liver flukes, and guinea worm, although there have been great strides made in preventing guinea worm infections in recent decades, and the number of infections has dropped off steeply. A final note before we move on from this section, we've been focusing heavily on water pollution as it occurs in surface water, like lakes, rivers, oceans, but groundwater pollution is also a problem. Groundwater can accrue contamination from both natural sources and human sources. A natural source of groundwater contamination in water is the erosion of rocks and minerals, which come into contact with that water in that underground environment. And of course, pollution discharges from human activities can infiltrate the ground and seep their way into aquifers as well. This includes the usual range of suspects that we've mentioned before, like agricultural runoff, runoff from urban environments. And then these human activities can also include leaking septic tanks. So, septic tanks, in case you don't know, they're an underground tank that's used to hold sewage for homes that aren't connected to a municipal sewage system. And they're more common in rural areas. But if those septic tanks leak, it can introduce fecal pathogens into the groundwater, which can then contaminate it with these infectious microorganisms. And then if people are drawing up that same groundwater through their wells, because it's all connected underground, then that's a way that those pathogens can be transmitted.